What should creationists think about feathered dinosaurs?
All right, so our third topic now, we've covered dinosaur anatomy and identification. We've covered what feathers look like on modern birds and what they look like when we see them as fossils. So now the question is, what do we see with dinosaurs and the presumed feathers or feather-like structures that have been talked about by many people on these? So Matt talked about cladograms and cladistics as a way of organizing and taxonomy. So here is a big old cladogram of a bunch of different dinosaurian families and groups. Dinosauria, you can see towards the left-hand side in the center of kind of this big branch, you see Dinosauria. Up above that is going to be the group of Ornithischians. That's going to be things like your duck-billed dinosaurs, your horned dinosaurs, your armored stuff, those types of dinosaurs. Below that is the Saurischia, which at least traditionally has had the long-necked sauropods, the first branch to the top on that one. And then your theropods, which is everything else below that. So we'll see how the cladograms sort out, but this is still one of the consensus perspectives out there. So what's on the right-hand side are silhouettes of different dinosaurs, so you get a sense of what their overall shape for the family group or what have you looks like. And then a bunch of different images right next to them on their left. The set where there's lots of little gray balls means that we've got some evidence of skin impressions, and it's scaly. Okay, so what we have of these organisms indicates scaly type of skin, the type of scales that we see on crocodilians, things like chicken feet that we were just talking about, not the sort of scales that you see on a lizard. So Matt had mentioned that he's got a lizard at home. I do as well. I've got a skink, which means I have a tiny lizard compared to the bearded dragon that he's got. But nonetheless, two paleontologists who like their modern reptiles. But their scales look different from what we see on crocodilians, dinosaur skin, and even bird skin, things like that. So the little gray balls mean scale impressions are known from that group. Then we see things like the little blue, almost looks like a spider. That's where there's tuffaceous material. It looks kind of like down on them. And you can see that there's one blue up towards the top in this animal called Cylindrodromeus. And then there's another blue by, oh, wow, the Tyrannosauroidea. That's the family that includes T-Rex. And then in a bunch of the other ones, we have some other kind of little branches, some tan feathers. And then towards the very bottom, it looks like what seem to be kind of modern wing feathers. Okay, so all of that is shown on the left side in the types of integument box. So a variety of different types of integuments found from a wide array of the Dinosauria, the Ornithischians, the theropods, and so far only the Sauropoda is the only major group that seems to only have scales known from them at this time. So let's take a look at some of those Saurischian dinosaurs, in particular the theropods, the meat-eating dinosaurs. So we're going to kind of follow this cladogram a little bit and look at some of the different material that has been discovered. So this one's listed as a non-Maniraptoran. Let me just go back 2 slides here. The Maniraptorans are, let's see, if you look at where the Tyrannosauroidea was, the T-Rex, which has got that blue spider-looking thing next to it, you drop down one more from there, and you get to Maniraptor morpha, Maniraptoriformes, Maniraptora. Okay, all that means is animals that are similar to the raptors in various sorts of ways. Maniraptora means hand snatchers or hand thieves, if you will, thieves. And it includes the classic things like Velociraptor, and it's going to include a bunch of others. But there are dinosaurs outside of that group that seem to have some fuzzy integument as well. So the first of these is this animal called Sciuromimus. Its name actually means squirrel mimic. Not because it really looks anything like a squirrel, but actually because the whole thing was really, really fuzzy. It's a fairly small theropod dinosaur. It's not very large, but it had this giant thick tail, which is partially visible on the right-hand side of your screen. You can see that there's kind of this black line to the left of the tail, and from that black line to the tail is nothing but fuzz, large amounts of fuzz. And so C and D there are zones that I zoomed in on, so you could see kind of these fibrous materials moving from top to bottom. And you'll notice on D below, you've got a couple of large white blobs there. Those are the vertebrae. So those are the backbones and little spines coming up vertically from the backbone. And then these fibers start just a little bit above that. And that makes sense because these are fibers that are coming out of the skin. Feathers are integument, right? They're coming up out of the skin. Likewise, in C, the fibers just above the vertebrae start just over, just atop those little neural spines. So they seem to be in the right place. This is an animal that might be part of what's called the megalosaurids. That's actually one of the first dinosaurs ever discovered, Megalosaurus. We're not entirely sure if it belongs to that because it's juvenile, and so some of its bones haven't fully grown into position. So there's some question as exactly where it goes. But nonetheless, we know that it's not, say, one of the raptor groups. Its skull is very different from that. Some of the feet and the hand components are very different from that. So we've got something here, and it's so fuzzy with this huge, thick, fuzzy tail that it was called squirrel mimic because it was like, that's a squirrel tail on a dinosaur. Well, we've got a couple of tyrannosauroids too. So Tyrannosauroideae is the superfamily or order in which the Tyrannosaurus and its ilk are all found in. One of the animals that is found in this group, we think, is an animal called Dilong. It's from lower Cretaceous units in China, and Dilong was found with a lot of its skeleton. You can see all the white skeletal pieces on the top. Those are all the bones that were recovered from the skeleton, so quite a bit. And there was a whole bunch of fuzz and fluff found around it. So I've zoomed in on one component of part of the tailbone, or bones, I should say, in the tail. And you can see these darkened lines kind of sweeping from right to left. And those are fuzzy integument of some kind that are located along the tail. And there was more of that around the leg bones. There was some of that around the left arm and some of that around the face. So they've reconstructed this as an animal that's kind of fuzzy all around because if you're finding it on the legs and the tail and the arms and somewhere around the face, chances are it's got fuzz pretty much everywhere. So especially along the tail and the left mandible. Mandible is the lower jawbone. So your lower left jawbone had a bunch of it. That's why they give a little extra fuzz to it in that illustration. So this thing probably part of the Tyrannosauroid group. Eutyrannus certainly is. And this is known from 3 skeletons that were all found together. Potentially a good indicator of a rapid and catastrophic burial of 3 different animals all kind of caught up together. And Eutyrannus is pretty good size, 7 to 9 meters long. So we're talking about a, roughly 23 to 30 foot long animal. That's big. That's as big as, Allosaurus for the most part. And but it's a tyrannosauroid called Eutyrannus, also coming from lower Cretaceous rocks of China. And this one had very densely packed filaments, some of them as much as 15 centimeters long. So, that's about 6 inches, give or take. Some people, especially in creationism, had said, maybe these are fibers of collagen. Collagen is the connective tissue that's underneath your skin, for example, that lets your skin move around, but not move around too far. And when an animal dies, that collagen might be able to fray out a little bit, but the collagen is not going to be that long on an animal. Otherwise, its skin is going to be all saggy and droopy. It's going to look like couple of different dog breeds. Probably not what was going on with the dinosaurs. Their skin's going to be a little more tight to their body. And so we've got these nice long branching filaments around the face, the arms, the legs, and the tail. And they're typically a couple of centimeters, but upwards of 15, 16, 17 centimeters long. So this seems to be an animal that is covered in a lot of fuzz, and it's a big animal. This isn't small. This is a good size animal. And so you might be wondering, well, what are you going to use this for? And they're not using it to fly. This animal's not flying. But think back to the types of feathers that we looked at, right? Only 2 feather types were used directly for flight. And those were the remiges and the retices, the wing feathers and the tail feathers. The rest of the feathers on the bird body are used for coloration and species identification. for male-female identification, right? You see different members of the same species, and the males and the females have different colors. Think of cardinals. It's going to be used for thermal regulation to keep in heat. So these are all the sorts of things that feathers are function, as far as what they do. That's their function, is to do a variety of different sorts of things. So Yutyrannus has got what seems to be a large amount of fibrous filamentous plumage on its body, and it's probably helping it to know, are you part of my species or not? We don't know if they're also using it for male-female identification, probably helping to keep the animals warm, because dinosaurs were warm-blooded. So they need to keep their temperatures maintained. That means they've got to keep their heat in. Another really interesting group of dinosaurs that have feathers, or at least kind of what seem to be fibrous, feathery integument, are the group that are called the Therizinosaurs. Now, if you saw Jurassic World Dominion, the last movie that came out, you have my condolences. It was not a great movie. There were two plot lines, and neither of them were really good. But the dinosaurs were fantastic. They were so good. And the grouchiest, grumpiest dinosaur in the whole movie is this big, ponderous Therizinosaurus. And the first thing that you see it do is just swipe a deer out of existence for no good reason, because these animals are herbivores. Even though they're in the meat-eating dinosaur group, they're kind of like the Pandasauruses. They are dumpy and not fast and ponderous, and they've got these big long claws on their hands, mostly for like gathering and shredding vegetation and eating plants. And Bepiosaurus is one of these members, and it has a huge amount of fibrous material on its body. This is all that's known from Bepiosaurus. There might be a few other bones here and there, but it's kind of like this big plate that's got the skull, the neck going to about the shoulder area, and some of the arm. The rest of the skeleton was not collected. I think it might have been destroyed in a quarry, but I can't remember exactly. But there's a couple of close-ups on these bones, a few other pieces here and there, some parts of the neck, and you can see these blackish brown fibers coming off from the vertebrae that are on the right, and in the part of B, the fibers are coming off towards the left. These areas of the fossil were actually sampled, and a chemical assay was done on them, and it turned out that they were made of keratin. Okay, so remember that keratin is the material that makes up hair and fingernails and claws on things like mammals, and is also the material that makes up feathers on birds. We had two types. We have alpha keratin and beta keratin. So this stuff was sampled, and actually both alpha and beta keratins were found, primarily alpha keratins. As it turns out, there was a paper that came out last week or the week before. I was just reading it. And it's a paper by, let me just pull up the names here. Yeah, Slater et al. And it was published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. I guess, yeah, it was published in September, so just a couple of weeks ago. And they did a fascinating experiment where they took modern feathers from birds and they heated them up to temperatures like 200 to 250 degrees Celsius in order to simulate the temperatures that these types of fossils would have experienced during the process of fossilization, right? So this animal goes in as bone and other stuff. It's subjected to heat, subjected to pressure. There's mineral replacement that happens, and the temperatures are rather high. They're like oven hot for this stuff. So 250 degrees Celsius is like 450 degrees. So they baked modern feathers at these temperatures, and then they ran chemical analyses. And what they found is that at the higher temperature, at 250 degrees, the beta keratin structure of modern feathers broke apart into alpha keratin parts. And so they went back and were evaluating some other evolutionist hypotheses. Some evolutionists said, well, maybe feathers started out as being made of alpha keratins, and later the beta keratin system evolved. And these authors, who are evolutionists as well, looked at this and said, nope, that's not what's happening. It turns out that the process of fossilization is degrading the protein and going from alpha to beta. It's kind of unraveling and forming a simpler structure. And basically their argument is no, the feather material is the same exact stuff in the fossil record, because what we see chemically from the fossils matches almost exactly what we did in the lab when we just baked a bunch of feathers. In one sense, a simple experiment, but then you have to do the chemical identification part. That's not so simple. And I think from a creation perspective, this is really cool because it makes sense. Like, feathers have been feathers. And the earliest evidence that we have of feathers are still feathers, right? The fibers and whatnot, they're made of the same exact stuff. So we know that these structures are made of keratin, and we now know from experimental research that if we look at them and say, oh, but they're alpha keratin, well, that's because fossilization does damage to things. And in this case, heat and high temperatures does damage to the feathers. And interestingly, they checked them against bird feathers as well, and they found that some bird feathers from the Green River Formation, which is up above dinosaur-bearing units, they had fewer beta carotens. They'd have been subjected to higher temperatures than the stuff in China had. And so the dinosaur stuff, which should have been more primitive, according to the theory, and would have been only alpha keratins, no, they actually had plenty of beta keratins, more than the actual bird fossils. So again, I think good, interesting argument with creation, that feathers have always been feathers and made of the same things that we see modern feathers made of. And they're found in this animal, Bepiosaurus, this panda dinosaur. This is one of the coolest ones here. And for me, it's historically important because I was skeptical as a grad student about dinosaurs having feathers. When I was in grad school, starting in 1999 through 2005, those first early years when a couple of feathered dinosaur fossils were coming out of China, the evidence was, it was okay. It might have been fairly strong, but I didn't think that it was completely compelling. And there were only a couple of taxa, and there were a couple of paleontologists who were saying, nope, these aren't feathers. And so there was good room for discussion and debate on this. There was good room for there to be difference of opinion on these things. All that changed, at least for me, with the discovery of Microraptor and the discovery of full skeletons of Microraptor. Microraptor was an animal that was first identified from partial skeleton. We recognized that it was a little raptor dinosaur. It's in the same family as Dromaeosaurus and Deinonychus and Velociraptor. It's got that cool little raptor claw, and it's a small one. All right, it's Microraptor. It's about the size of a crow with a tail, a long tail, and it's got a long bony tail, but it was completely covered with feathers. When full skeletons came out a few years after its initial description, new specimens were found, and it was covered head to toe in these beautiful, long flight feathers. Not just fuzz or fibers or things like that, but feathers that were clearly adapted to being able to at least glide through the air. The animal didn't have very strong muscles. It didn't have a big keel with on their sternum or anything like that. So it was probably a very weak flyer. Just getting from one tree to the next was enough work. Certainly wasn't going to be migrating. This is an image of some of the Microraptor fossils subjected to ultraviolet light, and kind of, they sort of almost fluoresce. And you take pictures of these, and you can see these long, dark lines going, again, all the way close to the bones and not quite. They get to the skin. And this animal is really cool because it had feathers all along its legs, along with its arms. So it was doing that like weird feathered chicken thing, only not feather dusters at the end of its feet, but like feathers that might have been able to actually help with direction during times of flight. Really, really interesting. For a while, people thought maybe it flew like a biplane with a stack of wings and then another stack of wings. That anatomically doesn't really work. It's more like it's got its wings, its arms and wings spread out, and the other ones are going kind of straight to the back, and probably operating a bit kind of like an airfoil or kind of the vertical spine on an airplane. So in 2003 or so, when Microraptor was announced and here were the new fossils, I went, all right, it's definitely a dinosaur. I knew anatomically it checked all those boxes that Dr. McLain was talking about, and a bunch more to be more specific to being a raptor dinosaur. And yet here it was, head to toe with beautiful feathers, and they got lots of specimens of this now. So that really did it for me. And here's a picture of one of those, not under UV light, but you can see the feathers coming off of the arms and towards the middle there. is where some of those feathers are coming off of the legs. And if you follow the tail down, you see that the tail also has this set of feathers coming off of it. So in a little bit of a tiny fan of feathers. And it also is preserved well enough that we can see the little color bodies that are inside the feathers. These are called melanosomes. And we now know, based on the structure of those melanosomes, or at least we infer from what we see there, that Microraptor would have looked like a crow in that black, iridescent, purple, blue color stuff. It's really, really cool. And there's more and more dinosaurs and more birds that have these melanosomes preserved. I was at a scientific meeting when the first of these was uncovered, and it was a fossil from a fossil bird coming from Germany in what's called the Messel Shale. And they were able to identify the melanosomes, these little color bodies. They're like little balls or rods, and the different shapes indicate different color types that are be found on birds. So we can see this with modern birds. We look at their feathers under a microscope, and we can see these little structures, and they're the ones controlling color. And so they said, hey, we were able to identify these in this bird fossil from Germany in the Messel Shale, and we all kind of like our jaws dropped, because for the first time ever, this actually meant that we could know some of the colors of fossil animals. Right? Until then, it was guesswork. We didn't know if the dinosaurs were, green or purple or whatever. We figured they probably weren't purple. They're probably green and gray, right? We had all these bland sorts of ideas, but now it's like, no, wait, like real color for these fossils. So, I mean, some of the preservation here is just astonishing. We also can tell sometimes that animals had animals had feathers, even when there's no feathers preserved. So this was a fossil bone of Velociraptor that was recovered from the American Museum of Natural History's excursion to Mongolia back in the 1920s. And some scientists went back, and in 2007, they published a paper looking at one of these bones from this historic collection, and they found that there were these little bumps on the forearm bone of Velociraptor, where these little white lines are on the gray image in the upper part here. So you got the very top is the ulna, the whole picture of the ulna. That's your forearm bone right over here. So Velociraptor's forearm bone. The gray is another image of it, and they've got these little white lines pointing to these little bumps that are pretty regularly spaced. You can see that these are pretty evenly spaced from one to another. The next two images are from a modern turkey vulture. So turkey vulture is a really big bird. We have loads of them around where I live here in Virginia, and their wingspan can be 3.5, 4 feet, 5 feet wide. And they have these little bumps on their forearm as well. These bumps are ways in which the bone actually grows to provide additional support to the feathers. So what I've said a couple of times now is that feathers are in the integument, they're in the skin, and they don't grow into the bone. But very large feathers have an effect on the growth of the bone itself. The bone will respond to the stress of having a large feather that needs a lot of muscle support to help control the flight by growing into a little mound and a little bump. And that gives more surface area for the muscles and the tendons to attach to help with that big feather. And so there's one bump for each of the major feathers going down the ulna of the turkey vulture. And it looks like Velociraptor's got the same type of raised bumps. We call these ulnar papillae. They're more easily called quill knobs. And they're known from a couple of other dinosaurs, Velociraptor, along with a close cousin called Dakotaraptor, and also a really interesting animal called Concavinator. It has some wild things going on with its spine. It had like this really almost like shark fin like going up on its backbone. Crazy animal, and it's been illustrated with like these spines coming off. They didn't want to put on feathers because nobody had figured that type of animal would have feathers. But now I'd say fair game. Probably did have very large feathers or very large sharp quills, kind of like the cassowary, the modern cassowary does. So here we've got a couple of interesting things. Amongst the other Maniraptorans, the raptor group, we have Zenuang. It's a dromaeosaur, so it's in the group with Velociraptor itself, and preserved from the Lower Cretaceous of China. Huge, big wing sets with preserved wing feathers. a nice fan on its tail. Its tail is a little short compared to everybody else in its family, and also some stuff around its head. So, I mean, these images are from fossils that are exquisitely preserved, just absolutely stunningly preserved, and the impressions of the feathers are quite stunning. I mentioned somebody had asked, like, well, what are the dinosaurs that are flying? And so Microraptor can glide from one place to another. Some of these other ones might be able to glide, but here we have a group that actually could fly. These are animals called Scansoriopterigids, which is a crazy name. Um, basically means the running wing animals. And that's because they look like a bat. Their fingers are really long, and in between their fingers is a skin flap, just like bats do. But it's not a bat, it's not a mammal, it's a dinosaur. And not only does it have skin flaps, it's got feathers on its body as well. So bats have skin flaps and fur. These animals have skin flaps and feathers. Major feathers coming off of the tail, these huge long ones, 4 of them in each of the 3 types that we know. There's 2 species of 3 genera. We have Epidendrix, Yiki, and Scansoriopterichus. And they're all pretty small, so you can see the scale there. Take a look at, I guess I didn't have a picture of this, but again, membranous wings, followed by feathers on the wings, around the face, and then coming off of the legs. And their faces are kind of short and kind of crazy looking. They're really bizarre. It's the sort of thing, like, I had no idea that God had this kind of curious design in mind, because it's like the platypus of the dinosaur kind. These things are really, really wild, but definitely flying and capable of flight. So there's a few others out there. I mean, there's plenty of others. There's about 50 different dinosaurs that we know that have feathers. Those are the ones that I've taken a look at from the theropod side of things, from typically the meat-eating dinosaurs, aside from the panda group, right? Ornithischians, these are from a whole different set of dinosaurs that are not supposed to be on the line of evolution. So finding feathers in these groups, was really unexpected from an evolutionary perspective. Calindrodromius is perhaps one of the best. This animal was found in Russia, out in Siberia, and it has both scales and feathery, fuzzy stuff on it. It's got scales around its feet, and there's really beautiful, good skin impressions for this animal. But then it's got fuzz around the upper leg bone area, around the lower, the shin thigh bone, along with the femur. And it's got some fuzz around its tail and up around its head, but also had scales going down the latter part of its tail. So here's a really good example of an animal that has both on one body. And here's a couple of examples. On the upper part, you can see those scales, and they look like, nice kind of bricks, stacked one right next to one another. But then on the units below are the kind of fuzz and fibers and fluffy stuff. This is a fuzzy dinosaur, really fuzzy and not very large. If I go back, looks like I don't have a scale bar for the whole animal, but the whole animal is only a couple of feet long. Not very large at all. And it's a herbivorous dinosaur. In the center block labeled C, that's the skull there. And if you look at the teeth in that area, these are teeth that are all well designed for shredding vegetation. The teeth look kind of like leaves almost, and they just kind of grind away at vegetation. They're not good for eating meat. So this is definitely not a meat-eating dinosaur. Its hip structure is like the other Ornithischian groups and things like that. Also in this group, in a similar group called the Heterodontosaurs, is another dinosaur from China called Tianyuong. And Tianyuong is very easily identified as a heterodontosaur by the lower right image that you can see there, where there's this big canine tooth that's going from the lower jaw up into the snout. And there's kind of like this semicircle. That is a very characteristic structure in this family of dinosaurs. They've got this wild, almost tusk coming up from the bottom, and this notch in the upper jaw that it sits into. And then it's got small, kind of a beak out in front. And then the teeth behind are those leaf-shaped sort of teeth for slicing up vegetation. In the upper image, you can see the skull on the upper right, a little bit of the arm next to it, and then some of the feet. The legs and feet are what are going down there. And near the upper left is where you can see a whole lot of the fuzz and fluff, and also around underneath the chin is a bunch of it as well. So another animal with fuzzy stuff all over the place. It looks like hair or fibers. Here's a close-up of some of this. Some of these are quite long. They extend a good distance away from the body. So again, it's not like the stuff underneath your skin that helps hold your skin in place. It's not the collagen that's frayed out. But the image on the lower right that has a little bit of red in it, you can see kind of like, it's black, red, black. What that is the color pattern on this is that the fibers are dark at the edges and they're lighter in the middle. And what that means actually is if you took, say, a straw, like a drinking straw from a fast food thing, it's hollow in the center and feathers are hollow in their center. If you took that straw and you squashed it down, you would find that it's actually darker around the edges because there's more plastic that gets compacted into the same spot than if you're in the middle. So the edges kind of crush down and form a dense spot on the edges, and then the middle is lighter colored because that was the hollow area. So this was one of the first physical evidences for the hollow nature and structure of these materials. And again, this is in the group that's not supposed to be on like bird evolution side of things. So these animals definitely have a hollow fiber, and hair, like ours, is not a hollow fiber. It's a solid fiber. So definitely this isn't hair. This is feather. And this type of material is also seen in a very unexpected place in the dinosaurs. This is Psittacosaurus. Psittacosaurus is part of the horned dinosaurs like Triceratops. The things have frills and big horns on their faces. Well, there was a discovery of a Psittacosaur specimen in Mongolia. They're well known from that area. Very famous, lots of them out there. And this one had all these wild and crazy, like 9-inch long fibers, hairs, protruding out, except they're not hairs, right? Now, with enough evidence of feather everywhere, we can say that these are feather-like fibers. And these are a lot like the bristles or the phyloplume that we see on modern birds. The original description of this back in like 2009 or so was very, very careful. They were like, these look like they could be somehow connected to feathers, but we're not going to say that they are because we don't really know. So they were very, very cautious about it in a sciencey way of being very cautious. But now that we've got these same types of structures found in other Ornithischian dinosaurs and other ones that are on this group of the duckbills and the horned dinosaurs and the armored things, it seems very apparent now that even the horned dinosaurs might have had feather-like material on their bodies. So, I mean, what this means is that feather-like material is being found all over the place amongst the dinosaurs. And we're going to have to really start rethinking the way that we illustrate and consider what a dinosaur looks like. And one of the reasons I did like the last Jurassic Park movie is that they were willing to go full on fuzzy with things. They were very happy to be like, okay, does this thing have feathers? And the scientists are like, yes. Like, great. What kind of feathers? Like fuzz. Or these ones have like full feathers. And so you saw that with one of the raptor dinosaurs that chases Chris Pratt around, right? So that was the, all those different sorts of things. And it's going to be a wild way of reimagining. These aren't the dinosaurs I grew up with. Right? So for those who are listening going like, I don't know, Dr. Ross, Dr. McLain, I mean, really, it's not how I remember dinosaurs. It's not how I remember them either. And it's been part of my own academic journey and my own experience as a scientist to see this unfold over the course of, the last few decades and go, wow, it's sometimes really challenging. Like I said, initially, I didn't think that the evidence for feathers on dinosaurs was very strong. But then the really good evidence started showing up. And, you've got a choice, right? You can either kind of hold on and say, no, this is the way that I always knew it, and I want to keep it that way, or recognize that science is a process of continual discovery. And it's okay to look back and revisit what you thought you knew, what we did know for the time based on the best evidence that we had, and go, well, it turns out that picture was incomplete. And the picture of dinosaurs has been incomplete since the very beginning, and it's incomplete still now. And we're going to learn more as time goes on. And that's exciting. That's really, really fun. So now we've got lots of different types of feathers that are known from dinosaurs. Maybe some of these are an artifact of preservation. This was from Matt McLain's paper at the ICC in 2018. The ones that are in red, we're not entirely sure if those are real feather types, but the other ones, we've seen them all on different types of dinosaurs. So it's a lot of different stuff. All right, so that closes me out on this part, and so we can take a couple of questions before Matt brings us into what creationists have been doing in particular about feathered dinosaurs and research.
Great, thank you, Marcus. That was fascinating stuff. So yeah, I've got some questions here, and I think I mean, that last slide that you showed there, I think it's important to note too that all of those feather types, they all exist in, you find plumaceous feathers and those the very, very, primitive feathers together in the fossil record. I'm right about that, right? That it's not like you find the primitive feather below the pennaceous feather. I think Ceramimus that you talked about was one of the first ones that had some of these sort of primitive feathers, and yet Ceramimus occurs in the fossil record at about the same time that Archaeopteryx does, which has full plumaceous feathers. So I think it's important, just from a creationist perspective, to keep that in mind, that just because you have all these different sequences in a fossil feather, doesn't mean that the primitive ones occurred below the more advanced ones in the fossil record. They actually occur at the same time, which is fascinating from a creationist perspective. Okay, so there's some good questions here. So let me put them up on the screen. Okay, here's the first one. Have there been any fossils of feathered dinosaurs found outside of China?
Yeah, great question, Clive. Yes. So I showed a couple of different ones from several different areas. So, for example, Ceramimus was coming from Germany, and we've got stuff from Mongolia. So not China proper, but actually from Mongolia, from Russia. There's a really fascinating dinosaur fossil with feathers from Brazil that had to be repatriated because it was illegally confiscated from that country, and it kind of threw a monkey wrench into its description. I think Matt, is that one on hold, like until they get it back or something like that?
I was just thinking about this the other day. I don't remember actually where the current status is on that.
Yeah, so it's like they were going to publish on it, then it's like, wait a minute, this was kind of stolen, so we got to bring it back. And I think the area paleontologists in Brazil want to crack at it. So yeah, and in fact, we also have feathered dinosaurs from North America, from Canada. There's a ostrich mimic dinosaur, one of the Struthiomiimid groups, and it's got all sorts of fuzz around its legs and stuff like that. That was fascinating, actually, because that one was preserved in a sandstone, which normally doesn't, preserve fine material. Usually, the reason why things are found in places like China is the same answer for the reason why all the Archaeopteryx are found in Germany. It's like, well, that's because they're there, and because the conditions are absolutely perfect for in that particular area for preserving this level of detail. And in most places, you don't get that. You go to the Hell Creek to find T-Rex fossils. I mean, Matt knows this better than any of us here. So he works in the Lance Formation in Wyoming, and you're dealing with sandstones and mudstones, and you just don't get fine preservation. You get good bones, you get great bones, but you don't get those types of you don't get much for skin impressions, although you get a few here and there.
Excellent. Okay, so here's another one. This one is, why is Microraptor not aviale? I mean, I don't know if it is or not, actually, but there you go.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for the folks watching this, aviale is going to be the what paleontologists mean when they start calling things birds. Okay, we've got aves, which is all the modern birds, but there's birds in the fossil record that are definitely birds. So we need words for them too. So we have other sorts of words going down the list. And so aviale is where we kind of say, okay, we are in birds now. We're not in dinosaurs. We're not in what most people consider dinosaurs. So it gets tricky, right? When you got all these boxes and boxes and boxes, and everything's subsumed in dinosaurs somehow. But aviale is when you get to actual birds. So when you take a look at the skeleton of Microraptor itself, you can take a look at, say, the skull. That's going to be one of your lead indicators. You've got teeth in there that are recurved, so they're curving backwards. And they've got little serrations on them, just like Velociraptor teeth, just like Dromaeosaurus and the other types, Dakotaraptor, etc. Its hand structure is not a carpometacarpus. It's 3 sizable fingers, and they're not fused to one another. They're definitely mobile, able to grasp. You take a look at the tail. The tail is a long tail, and each of the vertebrae actually have these little prongs that grab onto the next one and hold it so that the tail is fairly rigid. It can flex and move a little bit, but it can't like flop everywhere. But it's also not like that little shortened, tiny little nub of bone that you get on modern birds that we call pygostyle. So pygostyle is like 6 or 7 vertebrae, maybe as many as 9, and they're all really tiny and fused. Microraptor's got a big long tail that looks like all the other raptors. And you look at its feet, it's got the hook claw like Velociraptor does as well. So this thing is ticking off all the check marks that you have as a raptor, as a dromaeosaurid dinosaur. And that's why when it was first discovered without feather impressions, it was recognized as a dromaeosaurid and put in that category. And then a couple years later, the feathered ones came out. It's like, oh, wow, turns out Microraptor is plumed like crazy. So, it's the skeleton that makes the decision on this. And skeletally, we can identify birds, and skeletally, we can identify the things that aren't birds. And Microraptor is sitting on the not bird side of aviale.
Excellent. Just with the Microraptor, like you said, it's got that carpometacarpus. It doesn't have the carpometacarpus, I should say. But in some of the, and of course, for the folks listening, there is some disagreement in creationist circles, which is totally fine, on where we, what we do with dinosaurs and feathers. And I think for the most part, the issue sort of comes down to classification, which is why Dr. McLain was talking about that. But I have read some papers. They want to call Microraptor a bird, for example. I find that difficult because it doesn't have the carpometacarpus. I mean, they will talk about a Hoatzin having some little claws, but even it has a carpometacarpus. The Microraptor definitely has those claws, right, on the manus.
Oh yeah.
And so I mean, what do you think about that? I mean, when we want to call it a bird because it's got feathers, but it's got the 3-clawed hand, which is not the same as you find in a modern bird.
I think that trying to say that something is a bird or not a bird pretty much solely on the basis of feathers, it becomes very problematic. Right. And because the fossil record is not giving us complete animals and all of their integument all of the time, right? We're looking at some of the best examples in the history of the world. I mean, these are really spectacular finds. We've got lots of Velociraptor material and Deinonychus and whatnot, and we don't have any feathers on them. But this thing skeletally looks so much like them that we put it in the same family, right? That would be like, as a modern equivalent, that would be like trying to say that something is really, really should be considered an otter, even though it's in the dog family. And you're like, well, wait a minute. You've got all this skeleton that says it's got dog. It's like, yeah, but it's got this one thing that it does with the fat tail. And because it's got this fat tail, we should put it in the otter group because this thing it's probably swimming. It's a swimming dog. And we don't want to have a transition between the dogs and the otter group. and I can understand that you don't want to, I don't think that there was a transition between dinosaurs and birds in kind of that traditional sense. But that doesn't mean that we break up members of a family and put them in wildly different spots simply because there's one anatomical unit that it's got that makes us feel uncomfortable. We've got to deal with the whole organism. And when it comes to Microraptor and loads of these other things, that's what we have. We're able to identify these things to families fairly easily once you get the right training. I mean, it's not that it's simple, but once you know what you're looking for, you can do it. And so no, we don't want to put the dog in with the otters just because it has a fat tail. Yeah. And we don't want to put Microraptor in with the birds simply because it's got feathers.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, just one more question here, and then I will we'll go to the next presentation. So here's a question: thoughts on Proto-Avis?
Ooh, yikes! All right, thanks, Caleb, for that one. Proto-Avis is a nightmare of paleontological history. It was. I can't even call it because I don't think it's a thing. The discovery was made out in Texas by Sankar Chatterjee in Triassic rocks. So, dawn of the dinosaurs type of thing in the traditional perspective on this. This is early stuff. This is way before Archaeopteryx, way before any of the raptors or anything like that. And he believed that he found the first bones of a bird. And so he called it Proto-Avis. The problem is that Proto-Avis was made up of skeletal material from 2 totally different locations, at least. The notes weren't very good on this, but we knew that the material was coming from different areas. The material is not well preserved. It's really bad and very fragmentary and broken. And nobody besides Sankar Chatterjee, I think, has ever believed that it really belonged to a bird. Like the people who went out with him, or like, I don't know, but he thought he had the thing, and it's one of those things in paleontology where like everybody just kind of hopes that it just dies and goes away, and sooner or later like somebody will look at it and figure out what it actually is and save us from this. But until then, nobody's going to pay it any attention because nobody thinks that it's actually a legitimate single fossil. It's a variety of different things, and good luck.
Yeah, so when you got the jumbled remains, they try to make one thing, we call that a chimera, right? Like in Greek mythology. And so my personal thoughts on Proto-Avis, everything Marcus said, I totally agree with. But so we've been recently learning more and more about animals called Dinosaurs. They're these really unusual Triassic reptiles that have random features in common with birds. So like their skull will look kind of like a bird, and they've got like sometimes even toothless beaks and stuff. But then the rest of the animal looks like a lizard. I mean, it's got like a, kind of like a grabbing arms for climbing. They got some weird adaptations and stuff like that. Very interesting design on them. But my guess is probably the bird looking stuff in Proto-Avis is probably some Trypanosaur material then mixed in with some other things is what I would think.
Yeah. And when Chatterjee found this stuff, it was like early 80s. Early mid 80s, and so Trypanosaurs would have been hardly known to anybody at the time.
Cool.
That's a good insight. Thanks, Matt.
All right. Well, thank you guys, and thanks for the questions. Keep them coming. We've got one more presentation coming up here with Dr. McLain. So let me. So Matt, if you can add your PowerPoint, and I'm going to remove you, Marcus, here. And I'll remove myself and I'll put up this presentation. All right, Matt, just before you take it away, just again, another plug for those listening, especially for those that are watching the recording. Go ahead, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell as well. Okay, Matt, she's all yours. Well, that is the end of part 3. Please make sure to join me for the final part where Dr. Matt McLain is sort of going to put it all together into a creationist worldview. Now, before you go, please make sure to hit that like button, press the subscribe button, and ring the bell for easier access to more videos as I upload them. Look, if you want to give, there's a PayPal button in the description. That would be great. And of course, as always, I'd really appreciate prayer. Thank you and goodbye.